Sarah Chun pressed her back against the cold metal wall of the academy corridor, her breathing steady despite the thundering footsteps approaching from around the corner. The Galactic Military Academy's halls were designed to intimidate. Soaring ceilings that disappeared into shadow, walls of polished obsidian that reflected distorted images, and gravity fields that could be adjusted to simulate the crushing weight of a dozen different worlds. Tonight, however, the corridors felt more like a trap than a testament to galactic engineering. The footsteps belonged to Thrax the Bone Crusher, a Zephyrian cadet whose species had evolved on a planet where the gravity was 6 times stronger than Earth standard. His natural strength could pulverize titanium, and his temper was as legendary as his combat scores. Behind him walked Syrinx, a crystalline whose body could transform into living glass sharp enough to slice through battleship armor. The third member of their hunting party was Vorthak, a void walker whose ability to phase between dimensions made him nearly impossible to track or catch. They had been hunting her for 3 hours now. It had started in the combat simulation chamber, as these things always did. Sarah had been paired against Kelrian, a mid-tier Aquarian cadet whose species prided itself on honor and fair combat. She had been holding her own, not winning, but not embarrassing herself either, when Thrax had made his comment about dead weight and genetic waste taking up Academy space. The words themselves weren't unusual. Sarah had heard variations of the same insults every day since arriving at the Academy 6 months ago. What had been different was the way Thrax had said it, and the way the other cadets had laughed. Not the casual mockery she had grown accustomed to, but something darker, something that suggested they were tired of tolerating her presence. After the simulation, she had tried to return to her dormitory through the main corridors, but Thrax and his friends had been waiting. They had herded her deeper into the Academy's lower levels, using their superior speed and abilities to cut off her escape routes one by one. Now, she was lost in a section of the Academy she had never explored, somewhere in the sublevels where the lighting was dimmer and the security cameras were sparse. Human, Thrax's voice echoed off the walls, distorted by the corridor's acoustics into something that sounded more like a predator's growl than speech. "We know you're here. Why don't you come out and make this easy on yourself?" Syrinx's crystalline voice chimed in, each word ringing like shattered glass. "The Academy's waste disposal units are on this level. Very convenient for cleaning up accidents." Sarah closed her eyes and forced herself to think. Her human physiology was a disadvantage in almost every measurable way. She was slower than most species, weaker than all of them, and possessed no exotic abilities that could level the playing field. Her only advantages were her size, smaller than most cadets, allowing her to fit through spaces they couldn't, and her endurance. Humans were persistence hunters, evolved to chase prey across vast distances until exhaustion claimed the kill. But these weren't exhausted prey animals. These were 3 of the Academy's most dangerous cadets, and they had her trapped. The sound of metal scraping against stone told her that Thrax was dragging something heavy, probably one of the maintenance tools from the engineering bays. Syrinx's footsteps were silent, but the way light refracted strangely along the walls indicated she was shifting her crystalline form into something sharp and deadly. Vorthak made no sound at all, which was somehow the most frightening thing of all. Sarah opened her eyes and studied her surroundings. She was in a maintenance junction where several corridors met. Overhead, a network of pipes and conduits carried power and life support throughout this section of the Academy. The walls were lined with access panels and emergency controls. Nothing immediately useful for combat, but plenty of places to hide or create distractions. A plan began to form in her mind. It wasn't a good plan, it was desperate and dangerous and would probably get her killed. But it was the only chance she had. She reached up and quietly opened one of the access panels. Inside was a maze of fiber optic cables carrying data throughout the Academy's network. She had spent enough time in technical classes to know which ones controlled lighting and which ones handled security systems. Very carefully, she began to disconnect cables in a specific sequence. The lights in the corridor flickered once, then died completely. Emergency lighting kicked in immediately, bathing everything in a dim red glow that created harsh shadows and blind spots. Sarah slipped out of her hiding place and began moving through the corridors, using the maze of pipes and conduits overhead to mask her footsteps. Clever little vermin, Thrax's voice boomed through the darkness. But darkness won't save you. My species hunted in caverns for millennia before we reached the stars. That was exactly what Sarah had been counting on. Zephyrians had excellent night vision, but it was adapted for the deep caves of their homeworld. In artificial lighting, especially red emergency illumination, their pupils would dilate too far, creating blind spots and making them vulnerable to sudden changes in light intensity. She found what she was looking for 3 corridors away, an emergency flare station. The flares were designed to provide intense white light for rescue operations, bright enough to signal through the hull of a damaged starship. Sarah armed 6 of them and began placing them strategically throughout the corridors. The sound of crystals scraping against metal told her that Syrinx was close. Too close. Sarah activated the first flare and threw it down the corridor behind her. The sudden burst of brilliant white light was visible even through closed eyelids. Somewhere in the distance, Thrax roared in pain and fury. She activated 2 more flares and tossed them in different directions, creating a pattern of blazing light sources that would confuse anyone trying to track her movement. Then, she began to run. Her plan was simple in its desperation. Create chaos, use her knowledge of human endurance to outlast her pursuers, and try to reach the upper levels where there would be other cadets and instructors to witness whatever these 3 had planned for her. But as she rounded a corner at full sprint, she ran directly into Vorthak. The Void Walker had phased partially out of normal space, making his body translucent and ghostly. His hands, however, were solid enough to grab her shoulders and slam her against the wall with bone-rattling force. "End of the line, human," he hissed. His species communicated through a combination of sounds and pheromones that universal translators could barely interpret. "You've caused us more trouble than you're worth." Sarah's vision swam from the impact, but her mind remained clear. Vorthak's phasing ability had one critical weakness that most beings didn't know about. When he shifted between dimensions, there was a split second where his molecular structure became unstable. During that moment, he was vulnerable to disruption. She had learned this not from combat classes, but from theoretical physics. Humans were the only species in the Academy that studied quantum mechanics as a hobby rather than a necessity. Sarah reached for the emergency beacon on her belt, a device all cadets carried in case of training accidents. Instead of activating it normally, she overloaded its power cell and slammed it against Vorthak's chest just as he began to phase. The resulting electromagnetic pulse was minor by galactic standards, but it was perfectly timed. Vorthak's scream was unlike anything Sarah had ever heard as his partially phased molecular structure was forced back into normal space. He collapsed, his form solidifying in what looked like an extremely painful way. "Impossible," he gasped. "How did you know?" Sarah didn't answer. She was already running again, leaving the Void Walker writhing on the ground behind her. 2 down, 1 to go. But as she reached the next junction, she realized her mistake. The sound of her combat with Vorthak had given away her position. Thrax was waiting for her, and he had found his own solution to the lighting problem. The Zephyrian had torn one of the maintenance lights from the ceiling and was holding it like a torch. His night vision might be compromised, but he didn't need to see clearly to crush her with brute force. "Clever little prey," he rumbled, stepping into the corridor to block her escape. But cleverness only goes so far. My people have been warriors for 10,000 years. We know how to deal with vermin that thinks it's smarter than its predators. Sarah backed against the wall, her mind racing. She had exhausted most of her tricks, and Thrax was too experienced to fall for the same electromagnetic pulse that had disabled Vorthak. The Zephyrian's bone and cartilage skeleton was completely organic, making him immune to electronic disruption. But as he advanced on her, Sarah noticed something interesting. The improvised torch he carried was creating dramatic shadows on the walls behind him. And in those shadows, she could see the outline of something he couldn't. Syrinx, approaching from behind in her crystalline form. The crystalline cadet had shaped herself into something resembling a glass spider, moving silently along the walls and ceiling. Her plan was obvious. Wait until Thrax engaged the human, then strike from behind to finish her off. What Syrinx didn't realize was that Sarah could see her reflection in the polished metal walls of the corridor. "You're right," Sarah said, loud enough for her voice to carry. "Humans aren't warriors like your people. We're something different, something worse." Thrax laughed, a sound like grinding stone. "Worse? You're barely even prey animals. Your species couldn't survive 5 minutes on any real warrior world." "That's where you're wrong," Sarah replied, and her voice carried a strange calm that made the Zephyrian pause. "We're not prey animals at all. We're persistence hunters. Do you know what that means?" She began to move slowly along the wall, positioning herself so that Thrax would have to turn to keep facing her. Behind him, Syrinx was getting into position for her attack. "It means we don't hunt by being stronger or faster," Sarah continued. "We hunt by being smarter, by using our prey's instincts against them, by making them think they're the predators right up until the moment they realize they've been walking into a trap." Thrax's eyes narrowed. "What trap?" "You're alone, injured, and surrounded." Sarah smiled, and something in that expression made the massive warrior take an involuntary step backward. "The trap where you brought a crystalline hunter into an enclosed space with metal walls, exposed power conduits, and a human who knows exactly how to create a localized electromagnetic pulse." Thrax spun around just in time to see Syrinx dropping from the ceiling above him, her crystalline form shaped into a series of deadly spikes. "Syrinx, no," he shouted. "She's planning some." Sarah activated her second emergency beacon. The electromagnetic pulse that filled the corridor was much stronger this time, amplified by the metal walls and focused by the power conduits running through the ceiling. It had no effect on Thrax's organic body, but Syrinx's crystalline form was essentially a complex network of living silicon. The pulse shattered her like glass. Thousands of crystalline fragments rained down on Thrax, each one razor-sharp and moving with the velocity of her dropped attack. The Zephyrian warrior, for all his strength and combat training, screamed as the improvised shrapnel storm tore into him. When the light faded and the fragments settled, Thrax lay unconscious on the floor, bleeding from dozens of cuts. Syrinx was slowly pulling her shattered form back together, but it would be hours before she could move properly again. Sarah stood over them both, breathing hard but uninjured. "That's what a persistence hunter looks like," she said quietly. "We don't overpower our prey. We make our prey overpower each other." The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the corridors, security teams responding to the electromagnetic pulses and emergency beacon signals. Sarah activated her communicator and called for medical assistance, then sat down to wait. As she waited, she thought about what had just happened. She had been forced to use tactics that most species would consider underhanded or dishonorable. She had turned her attackers against each other, used their own instincts and abilities as weapons, and had won a fight without throwing a single punch. It was, she realized, the most human thing she had ever done. The security team arrived to find 3 unconscious cadets and 1 human sitting calmly against the wall, her uniform torn but her expression serene. "What happened here?" demanded Commander Zexhai, the Academy's security chief. Sarah looked up at the insectoid officer and gave him a small, tired smile. "I think," she said, "they learned something new about human combat doctrine." The medical bay of the Galactic Military Academy buzzed with activity as 3 of its most expensive treatment pods worked overtime to repair the damage for what officials were calling an unfortunate training accident. Sarah sat on a simple examination bench, watching through the transparent aluminum viewing wall as medical nanobots rebuilt Syrinx's crystalline matrix 1 molecule at a time. Dr. Helvarian, The Academy's chief medical officer finished scanning Sarah's readings and frowned at his holographic display. The Centaurian physician had been working with multi-species physiology for over 2 decades, but he had never seen anything quite like this. "Your stress hormone levels are completely normal," he said, his 4 eyes independently focusing on different aspects of the readout. "Heart rate, blood pressure, neural activity, everything indicates you were in a state of calm focus during the entire incident. That's not typical for someone who was allegedly fighting for their life." Sarah nodded but said nothing. She had learned over the past 6 months that explaining human psychology to other species was often more trouble than it was worth. How could she tell him that the moment real danger had appeared, something ancient in her brain had simply turned off her fear and turned on her analytical mind? "The other cadets," Dr. Helverian continued, "are telling a very different story about what happened down there." "I'm sure they are," Sarah replied quietly. The examination room's door chimed, and Commander Zexhai entered along with another figure that made Sarah's spine straighten automatically. Admiral Korthax was the Academy's commanding officer, a being whose species had conquered half their galaxy before joining the Galactic Alliance. His presence at what should have been a routine disciplinary hearing meant this situation had escalated far beyond a simple cadet altercation. "Cadet Chun." Admiral Korthax's voice was like controlled thunder. "You've created quite a stir." "Sir, I was defending myself against 3 attackers who had cornered me in an isolated section of the Academy." 3 attackers, Commander Zexhai interjected, who claimed they were conducting a routine security patrol when they were ambushed by a human using prohibited weapons and illegal combat techniques. Sarah's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes grew colder. "Prohibited weapons, sir? Emergency beacons modified into electromagnetic pulse devices," the insectoid security chief explained. "Military-grade equipment altered for combat use by unauthorized personnel. I used standard Academy equipment in a non-standard way during a life-threatening emergency," Sarah corrected. "There's no regulation against improvised defensive measures when under attack." Admiral Korthax moved closer to the examination table, his massive form casting a shadow over the human cadet. "The problem, Cadet Chun, is that your story requires us to believe that a lone human outfought 3 of our most promising cadets using nothing but cleverness and modified emergency equipment." "Yes, sir. That's exactly what happened." "And you maintain that they initiated hostilities?" "They hunted me through the lower levels for 3 hours, sir. They made specific threats about disposal units and accidents. If the Academy security recordings from those corridors are still functional, they will confirm my account." Commander Zexhai's mandibles clicked together in what Sarah had learned was his species' equivalent of a frustrated sigh. "The recordings from that section were damaged during the electromagnetic pulses you generated." "Very convenient." Dr. Helverian looked up from his medical scanner. "Admiral, if I may interject, the injuries sustained by the other cadets are consistent with Cadet Chin's version of events. Vorthax shows signs of molecular disruption trauma that could only have occurred during voluntary phasing. Thrax's wounds are all from crystalline fragments moving at high velocity, not human-inflicted damage. And Cyrix's shatter pattern indicates she was in an attack configuration when the EMP struck her. Medical evidence can be interpreted many ways," Admiral Korthax rumbled. "What concerns me more is the tactical sophistication of this alleged defense. The timing of the electromagnetic pulses, the use of environmental hazards, the manipulation of the attacker's positions. This level of strategic thinking is not typical of first-year cadets." Sarah met the Admiral's gaze steadily. Human military doctrine emphasizes adaptability and the use of environmental advantages to overcome superior force. "Human military doctrine," Commander Zexhai said with obvious disdain, "is largely theoretical since your species has never faced a true galactic-level conflict." "No, sir," Sarah agreed. "We've only faced ourselves for the past 10,000 years. Every war, every conflict, every form of violence that could possibly exist, humans have perfected it against other humans. We've had to become very good at killing things that think exactly like we do. The examination room fell silent. In galactic military circles, single-species warfare was considered primitive and wasteful. Most advanced civilizations expanded into space to avoid resource conflicts, not to perfect new ways of destroying their own kind. Admiral Korthax studied Sarah with new interest. Elaborate on that statement, Cadet. Most galactic species fight instinctively, sir. They use their natural advantages, strength, speed, special abilities, to overcome their enemies. Humans fight intellectually. We analyze our opponents, identify their weaknesses, and then exploit those weaknesses with whatever tools we have available. We've been doing it to each other for millennia, which means we've gotten very good at fighting opponents who are just as smart as we are. And you believe this gives you an advantage against species that are stronger, faster, and possess abilities your kind cannot match. Sarah was quiet for a long moment before answering. Sir, 3 cadets who are stronger, faster, and possessed abilities I cannot match are currently in medical pods. I am sitting here having a conversation. I think the evidence speaks for itself. Dr. Helvarian's scanner chimed, and he frowned at the new readings. Admiral, there's something else you should see. Cadet Chin's brain activity during the incident shows some unusual patterns. What kind of patterns? Gomanzekai demandet. Her prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for higher reasoning and tactical planning, shows activity levels far beyond normal parameters. But more interesting is what happened to her amygdala. In lay terms, Dr. Admiral Korthax requested. The amygdala processes fear and emotional responses. During a life-threatening situation, most species show massive amygdala activation. Cadet Chin's amygdala essentially shut down completely. Her fear response was neurologically suppressed, while her analytical capabilities increased exponentially. Sarah saw the way the Admiral and Commander exchanged glances, and her stomach began to sink. She had hoped to graduate from the Academy quietly, serve her mandatory term in the Alliance fleet, and then return to Earth to pursue xenobiology research. But the expressions on their faces suggested her plans had just become much more complicated. Dr. Admiral Korthax said carefully, in your professional opinion, is this neurological response natural for humans? I don't have enough baseline data on human neurology to say definitively. Cadet Chun is only the 3rd human to attend this academy, and the first to undergo combat stress evaluation. But theoretically, Dr. Helvarian hesitated before answering. Theoretically, sir, this could represent an evolutionary adaptation. If humans have indeed spent millennia in constant warfare against their own species, natural selection might have favored individuals who could suppress emotional responses during combat while enhancing tactical reasoning. A species that evolves into natural tacticians, Commander Zexheim used. That would explain how they managed to develop interstellar technology despite constant warfare. Sarah remained silent, but her mind was racing. The conversation had moved far beyond her disciplinary hearing and into territory that could have implications for all of humanity's relationships with the galactic community. Admiral Korthax turned back to her. Cadet Chun, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want a direct answer. Do you believe that what happened tonight was representative of typical human combat capabilities? Sarah considered her words carefully. Sir, I believe that any human placed in a life-threatening situation would respond similarly. We're taught from childhood to analyze problems, use available resources, and adapt to changing circumstances. In a military academy setting, those skills naturally extend to combat scenarios. And the neurological suppression of fear responses. I can't speak for all humans, sir, but personally, I find that fear interferes with clear thinking. When my life is in danger, I need to think clearly more than I need to feel afraid. The examination room's door chimed again, and a new figure entered. Captain Therrell was the Academy's instructor for advanced tactical theory, a subject that most cadets found impossibly difficult. His species, the Korvashi, were natural mathematicians whose brains could process probability calculations in real time. Admiral, Captain Therrell said, I've completed the tactical analysis you requested. Report. Captain Therrell activated a holographic display that showed a three-dimensional map of the corridors where the incident had occurred. Based on the physical evidence and Cadet Chen's statement, I've reconstructed the sequence of events. The hologram showed Sarah's movements through the Academy's lower levels, with different colors representing the positions of her three pursuers. The tactical sophistication is remarkable, Captain Therrell continued. She used the environment to create force multipliers, turned her pursuers' strengths into liabilities, and manipulated their positions to achieve mutual destruction. Red lines appeared on the hologram, showing lines of sight and movement vectors. Most significantly, she anticipated their behavioral responses with near-perfect accuracy. The timing of the electromagnetic pulses, the placement of the light sources, the positioning that led to Siric's attacking Thrax. All of this required predictive modeling of her opponent's psychology. Admiral Korthax studied the display. What level of tactical training would be required to execute this strategy? Under normal circumstances, advanced officer candidate level minimum, possibly command staff level. But Cadet Chen claims she improvised the entire sequence during the encounter. And do you believe that's possible? Captain Therrell's mathematical mind worked through the probabilities. For most species, impossible. But humans? He paused, reviewing his calculations. Humans show unusual neurological plasticity. Their brains form new neural pathways at rates we previously thought were impossible. If Cadet Chen's brain was suppressing emotional responses while simultaneously creating new tactical neural networks in real time, it becomes possible, Dr. Helverian finished. Sarah watched the holographic replay of her own actions, seeing for the first time how they must have looked to outside observers. The movements that had felt like desperate improvisation appeared calculated and precise. The split-second decisions looked like the result of careful planning. Cadet Chun, Admiral Korthax said finally, I'm going to make you an offer. Sarah's attention snapped back to the present. Sir, you can continue with the standard cadet program, serve your mandatory term, and return to Earth as planned. Your disciplinary record will show that you acted in self-defense, and the other cadets will face appropriate consequences for their actions. Or you can transfer to the Academy's Advanced Warfare program. It's a specialized track for cadets who show exceptional tactical aptitude. Only 12 cadets from across the entire galaxy are selected each year. Sarah felt her carefully planned future crumbling around her. Sir, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not interested in a military career. Her sister was a puzzle solver who approached every problem by breaking it down into component parts and finding unexpected solutions. Her parents were both research scientists who had built their careers on analyzing complex systems and finding creative applications for existing technology. I don't know, she admitted finally. Admiral Korthax nodded, as if that answer confirmed his suspicions. Then, I suggest we find out. The Advanced Warfare program includes cross-species psychological studies and tactical analysis projects. You would have opportunities to study xenobiology while helping us understand human tactical capabilities. And if I refuse, then you return to the standard program, but with a new understanding that every eye in the Academy will be watching to see what the human does next. Sarah looked at the medical pods containing her unconscious attackers, then at the holographic display showing the tactical sophistication of her own actions, and finally at the faces of the Academy's senior staff who were waiting for her decision. How long do I have to decide? Until tomorrow morning, Admiral Korthax replied. But Cadet Chun, I think we both know you've already decided. The question is whether you're ready to admit it to yourself. As the Admiral and Commander left the examination room, Sarah remained sitting on the examination table, staring at the holographic replay of her own actions and wondering if she had just witnessed the beginning of something much larger than a simple disciplinary incident. In the medical pods, machines worked to repair the damage she had inflicted on 3 of the Academy's best cadets. And in her own mind, something that felt very much like a predator was beginning to wake up and take notice of the world around it. The advanced warfare classroom was unlike anything Sarah had experienced during her 6 months at the academy. Instead of the sterile lecture halls where most classes were conducted, this room resembled a command center from a frontline warship. Holographic displays covered every surface, showing real-time tactical scenarios from active conflicts across the galaxy. The 12 cadets selected for this program sat at individual workstations equipped with quantum processors capable of running military-grade combat simulations. Sarah had accepted Admiral Korthax's offer, though she wasn't entirely sure why. Perhaps it was curiosity about what the Academy's most advanced program would teach her. Perhaps it was the realization that refusing would mark her as someone trying to hide human capabilities. Or perhaps it was something deeper, a growing awareness that the incident in the corridors had awakened something in her that needed to understand what it was becoming. Cadet Chun, Professor Valders called out, his synthesized voice cutting through the ambient hum of processing equipment. The synthetic intelligence had been created by the Alliance's most advanced artificial minds specifically to analyze and teach warfare to biological species. His holographic avatar flickered slightly as he processed millions of tactical scenarios simultaneously. "You're 3 minutes late." "Yes, sir. I was completing medical clearance from yesterday's incident." Several of the other cadets turned to look at her, and Sarah realized that her reputation had preceded her. These were the Academy's elite students, cadets who had demonstrated exceptional tactical abilities from species known for their military prowess. The fact that a human had been added to their ranks after a single combat encounter would not have gone unnoticed. "Incident," Professor Valdres repeated, and something in his tone suggested amusement. An interesting euphemism for what our analysis indicates was a textbook application of asymmetric warfare principles. A cadet from the far side of the room raised her hand. Sarah recognized her as Zarathex, a draconian whose species had conquered 12 systems before joining the Alliance. Her scales shimmered with bioelectric patterns that indicated heightened attention. "Professor, is it true that Cadet Chun defeated 3 upper-class cadets without using any weapons?" "That depends on your definition of weapons," Professor Valders replied. "Cadet Chun, would you care to explain your tactical approach to the class?" Sarah felt 12 pairs of alien eyes focusing on her, each representing a species with its own approach to warfare. She had hoped to ease into the program quietly, but apparently that option was no longer available. "I used environmental advantages and opponent psychology to create advantageous engagement parameters," she said carefully. "Elaborate." Sarah stood and moved to the central holographic display. With a few gestures, she began reconstructing the corridor layout where the encounter had occurred. The basic tactical situation was 3 against 1, with the opponents holding advantages in speed, strength, and special abilities. Direct confrontation would have resulted in immediate defeat. She highlighted the positions where each of her attackers had been during the encounter. The solution was to use their advantages against them. Thrax's superior night vision became a liability when exposed to sudden bright light. Vorthax's phasing ability made him vulnerable to electromagnetic disruption during dimensional transition. Syrinx's crystalline form could be shattered by her own attack if properly redirected. A Korvashi cadet named Mathematical Precision of Intent raised his sensor array. "You determined all of this while under direct threat." "I didn't determine it," Sarah replied. "I recognized it." Human military theory emphasizes knowing your enemy's capabilities and limitations better than they do. Professor Valdres manipulated the holographic display to show detailed biometric data from the encounter. What's particularly interesting is Cadet Chen's neurological state during the engagement. Her brain essentially reconfigured itself to optimize for tactical processing while suppressing emotional responses. Zarathex's scales shifted to patterns indicating skepticism. That suggests premeditation. She knew this encounter was coming and prepared for it. "Actually, the opposite," Sarah interjected. "The neurological changes occurred during the encounter, not before it. My brain adapted in real time to the tactical requirements of the situation." The room fell silent except for the hum of processing equipment. Real-time neurological adaptation was theoretically possible, but No species had demonstrated the ability to actually accomplish it during combat. Professor, a crystalline cadet named harmonic resonance in battle chimed. Is this neurological plasticity typical for humans? That, Professor Valdres said, is exactly what we're here to determine. Cadet Shun, you've been selected for this program not because of what you've proven, but because of what you might represent. Today, we're going to test the limits of human tactical adaptation. The holographic display shifted to show a new scenario, a three-dimensional battlefield with multiple levels, environmental hazards, and opposing forces. Sarah studied it carefully, noting the positions of friendly and enemy units, available resources, and terrain features. This is a tactical simulation based on the Battle of Kepler 442, Professor Valdres explained. Alliance forces were outnumbered 5-1 by an enemy with superior technology and firepower. Historical records show that conventional tactical approaches resulted in complete defeat for Alliance forces. But Alliance forces won that battle, mathematical precision of intent observed. Exactly. They won by employing tactics that military theorists had previously considered impossible. Cadet Shun, you'll command Alliance forces. Your objective is to achieve victory against overwhelming odds using only the resources shown in the simulation. Sarah felt her pulse quicken, but her mind remained calm. She had played tactical simulations before, but never one based on actual historical battles. The pressure of performing in front of the Academy's elite students added another layer of complexity. What are my time constraints? She asked. The historical battle lasted 16 hours. You have 30 minutes to develop and execute a winning strategy. Sarah began studying the battlefield in detail. The enemy forces held the high ground and had established overlapping fields of fire that would devastate any direct assault. Their technology included energy shields that could deflect most Alliance weapons, and their numbers allowed them to maintain defensive positions while sending out raiding parties to harass Alliance supply lines. Conventional military wisdom would suggest either a fighting withdrawal to avoid total annihilation or a costly frontal assault that might succeed through sheer determination. But Sarah could see why those approaches had failed in the original timeline. Instead, she began looking for patterns in the enemy positioning. Military formations always reflected the psychology and tactical preferences of the species that created them. If she could identify what those preferences were, she might be able to exploit them. Professor, what species commanded the enemy forces in this battle? The Hegemony fleet was under the command of Admiral Vexthar, a Zephyrian military genius whose tactical brilliance had never been defeated. Sarah smiled, and something in that expression made several cadets lean forward with interest. She had just spent an evening learning how to outthink a Zephyrian warrior. Their psychology was becoming familiar to her. She began moving units on the holographic display, creating what appeared to be a series of small probing attacks against different sections of the enemy line. To the watching cadets, her strategy looked like exactly the kind of ineffective harassment that had failed in the historical timeline. Cadet Shun, Zarathek said, "You're dispersing your forces across too many objectives." Basic tactical theory indicates that concentration of force is essential when facing superior numbers. Basic tactical theory assumes your opponent doesn't know basic tactical theory, Sarah replied, without looking up from the display. Admiral Vexthar would be expecting concentrated attacks, because that's what Zephyrian psychology considers honorable combat. She continued repositioning units, creating patterns that seemed random to casual observation. But Sarah was thinking several moves ahead, using her knowledge of Zephyrian psychology to predict how the enemy would respond to each apparent attack. Zephyrians valued direct confrontation and viewed tactical deception as cowardly. When faced with multiple small attacks, their instinctive response would be to consolidate their forces and launch a massive counterattack designed to crush the Alliance forces through superior firepower. That counterattack would require them to abandon their defensive positions and move into open terrain where their numerical advantage would be less significant. 15 minutes into the simulation, The enemy forces did exactly what Sarah had predicted. Admiral Vexthar's fleet abandoned their fortified positions and launched an overwhelming assault against what appeared to be the Alliance's main force concentration. But Sarah's main force was actually a decoy, carefully positioned holographic projectors and automated defense drones designed to mimic the energy signatures of a full military formation. The real Alliance forces were positioned in a crescent formation that enclosed the enemy's line of advance. When Admiral Vexthar's forces reached the decoy position and discovered the deception, they found themselves trapped in a crossfire from 3 directions with no defensive cover. The simulation ended with the complete destruction of enemy forces and minimal Alliance casualties. The Advanced Warfare classroom was completely silent for nearly a full minute. Professor Valdres finally broke the silence. "Cadet Shun, please explain your tactical reasoning." Sarah turned to face the class, and for the first time since arriving at the academy, she felt completely confident in her abilities. Zephyrian military psychology emphasizes honor and direct confrontation. Admiral Vexthar would view my dispersed attacks as evidence of Alliance cowardice and would feel compelled to demonstrate Zephyrian superiority through overwhelming force. By giving him a target that appeared to justify his psychological expectations, I could predict his tactical responses with near certainty. You base your entire strategy on enemy psychology rather than enemy capabilities? Psychology determines how capabilities are used, Sarah replied. Superior firepower means nothing if it's aimed at the wrong target. Mathematical precision of intent sensor array was working overtime, processing probability calculations. The success rate for that strategy, assuming you correctly predicted enemy psychology, would be approximately 67%. But if you had misread their behavioral patterns, complete annihilation, Sarah agreed. But I didn't misread them. Humans are very good at understanding how other minds work. Zarathex's scales were now showing patterns indicating excitement rather than skepticism. Professor, how does this compare to the historical outcome? The historical Alliance victory took 16 hours and resulted in 38% casualties, Professor Valdres replied. Cadet Shun achieved the same objective in 30 minutes with less than 5% losses. How is that possible? Sarah looked around the classroom at 12 of the galaxy's most promising military cadets, each representing species with thousands of years of military tradition. But none of them, she realized, had evolved on a world where every form of warfare had been perfected by beings who thought exactly like they did. It's possible, she said quietly, because humans don't just study warfare as an abstract concept. We've lived it, breathed it, and perfected it against opponents who were just as intelligent, just as adaptable, and just as desperate as we were. Every tactical principle, every psychological manipulation, every form of deception, we've used all of it against ourselves for millennia. The room remained silent as the implications of that statement settled over the assembled cadets. Professor, harmonic resonance in battle chimed. Does this mean humans are naturally superior tacticians? No, Sarah answered before Professor Valdres could respond. It means we're naturally paranoid tacticians. We assume our enemies are as smart as we are because our enemies have always been as smart as we are. Professor Valdres flickered slightly as he processed this new data. Class dismissed. Cadet Shun, please remain behind. As the other cadets filed out, several of them looked back at Sarah with expressions that combined respect, curiosity, and something that might have been concern. When they were alone, Professor Valdres's holographic avatar solidified into higher resolution. Cadet Shun, in my 300 years of analyzing military tactics, I have never seen a cadet demonstrate the level of psychological warfare expertise you showed today. Thank you, sir. That wasn't a compliment. It was an observation. What you demonstrated today suggests that humans don't just study warfare. They think like warfare. Your entire cognitive process appears to be optimized for conflict analysis and tactical manipulation. Sarah felt a chill as she realized what the synthetic intelligence was suggesting. Sir, are you saying that you think humans are naturally violent? I'm saying that your species appears to have evolved cognitive mechanisms that treat every social interaction as a potential conflict scenario. The neurological adaptations that allowed you to defeat 3 superior opponents, the psychological analysis that let you outthink a military genius, the tactical sophistication you demonstrated today. These aren't learned skills. They're evolutionary adaptations. Sarah stared at the holographic display, still showing her victory over Admiral Vextar's forces. What does that mean for humanity's relationship with the galactic community? Professor Valdris was quiet for a long moment before answering. I think, he said finally, that's the question everyone is going to be asking. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah's demonstration in the Advanced Warfare program, and the Academy had become a different place. Word of the human cadet who had defeated 3 upperclassmen and then outmaneuvered a legendary military genius in simulation had spread throughout the student body. But instead of the admiration or respect Sarah might have expected, she found herself increasingly isolated. Conversations stopped when she entered a room. Study groups disbanded when she tried to join them. Even casual interactions in the mess hall became stilted and uncomfortable. It wasn't hatred or fear she saw in her fellow cadets' eyes. It was something worse. It was the recognition that they were looking at something fundamentally different from themselves. Sarah sat alone at her usual table in the Academy library, surrounded by holographic displays showing xenobiology texts and galactic political theory. She was trying to understand the broader implications of what Professor Valdris had suggested about human cognitive evolution, but her research was painting an increasingly disturbing picture. Every species in the galactic community had evolved past large-scale warfare within their own kind. The Zephyrians had channeled their aggressive instincts into ritualized combat that rarely resulted in death. The crystalline had developed communication methods so sophisticated that conflict resolution happened at the molecular level. Even the notoriously territorial Draconians had evolved social structures that prevented intraspecies warfare through careful resource distribution. Humans were apparently unique in having developed increasingly sophisticated methods of killing each other right up until the moment they achieved interstellar travel. Cadet Shun, a voice interrupted her thoughts. Sarah looked up to see Captain Therrell, the Korvashi instructor for advanced tactical theory. His mathematical mind was one of the few at the Academy that seemed genuinely fascinated rather than disturbed by human tactical capabilities. Captain, how can I help you? I've been analyzing the psychological profiles of human military leaders throughout your species' history, he said, settling his bulk into a chair designed for multi-species use. I have some questions about your tactical development that might help us understand what we observe in your recent demonstrations. Sarah gestured for him to continue, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear where this was heading. According to historical records, humans have engaged in systematic warfare for approximately 12,000 years. During that time, your species developed every form of military strategy that currently exists in galactic doctrine, plus several that no other species has ever conceived, such as psychological warfare designed to break enemy morale through terror rather than direct combat, economic warfare that destroys civilizations without firing a shot, information warfare that turns populations against their own governments, and, perhaps most significantly, total warfare, the deliberate targeting of civilian populations to break an enemy's will to fight. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. Captain, I hope you're not suggesting that I would. I'm not suggesting anything about your personal intentions, Captain Therrell interrupted. I'm trying to understand whether these tactical concepts are accessible to all humans or represent aberrations in your species' development. The question hung in the air between them like a toxic cloud. Sarah realized that this conversation would determine not just how the Academy viewed her, but potentially how the entire galactic community would view humanity. Captain, can I ask you something? Of course. When your species encounters a problem that can't be solved through mathematical analysis, what do you do? Captain Therrell's sensor array reconfigured itself slightly. We adjust our mathematical models until a solution becomes apparent. All problems are ultimately mathematical in nature. And if adjusting the models fails, that scenario is theoretically impossible. Mathematics describes all possible realities. Sarah nodded, understanding something important about the gap between human and galactic thinking. Captain, humans evolved on a world where the mathematical models regularly failed. With a correct answer to a survival problem could change completely based on factors we couldn't predict or control. She activated her workstation's holographic display and brought up an image of Earth's surface. Our planet experienced regular climate shifts, massive volcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, ice ages, and ecosystem collapses. Species that survived were the ones that could adapt not just to new environments, but to the concept that their environment would always be changing in ways they couldn't predict. Cognitive flexibility, Captain Therrell mused. But that doesn't explain the sophisticated warfare development. Yes, it does, Sarah replied, and her voice carried a tone that made the Korvashi's mathematical mind focus intently on her words. Because the most unpredictable factor in any human's environment was always other humans. We didn't just have to adapt to changing climates or predators. We had to adapt to opponents who were actively trying to out-adapt us. She manipulated the display to show human population growth and migration patterns over millennia. Every time humans developed a new survival strategy, other humans developed countermeasures. Every innovation in cooperation was matched by innovations in competition. Every improvement in defensive capability was met with improvements in offensive capability. An evolutionary arms race against your own species, Captain Therrell said, his voice filled with something approaching awe. For 12,000 years, Sarah confirmed. While other species were developing past the need for warfare, humans were perfecting it. Not because we're naturally violent, but because we're naturally adaptive, and the thing we had to adapt to most was each other. Captain Therrell was silent for a long moment, processing calculations at speeds that would overwhelm most biological brains. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that Sarah had never heard from him before. Cadet Shun, I need to show you something. But first, I need you to understand that what I'm about to reveal has implications that extend far beyond your personal situation. Sarah felt the familiar chill of approaching danger, but her mind remained clear and analytical. What kind of implications? Instead of answering, Captain Therrell activated his own access codes and brought up a classified display that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. It was a galactic strategic overview showing current military deployments, threat assessments, and defensive preparations across all Alliance territories. Red zones indicating hostile activity covered nearly a quarter of the display. The Hegemony War didn't end with the Alliance victory at Kepler 442, Captain Therrell explained. It paused while both sides consolidated resources and developed new technologies. Intelligence reports suggest they're preparing for a renewed offensive that will begin within the next 18 months. Sarah studied the strategic display, and her mind automatically began analyzing force concentration, supply lines, and defensive vulnerabilities. What she saw made her stomach drop. Captain, the Alliance defensive positions are completely inadequate for this level of threat. Explain. Sarah pointed to several sectors where Alliance forces were spread too thin to mount effective resistance. The Hegemony is using a classic misdirection strategy. They're creating obvious threat concentrations here and here to draw Alliance attention, but their real offensive capability is being built up in sectors that appear lightly defended. Her finger traced patterns across the holographic display. When they attack, they'll use these apparent weak points to achieve breakthrough penetrations, then roll up Alliance forces from behind while their obvious threats pin Alliance reserves in place. How long would it take Alliance forces to recognize this strategy and adapt their defensive positions? Sarah ran the calculations in her mind, factoring in Alliance decision-making processes, communication delays, and logistical requirements. 6 months minimum, probably closer to 8. And how long would it take the Hegemony to achieve their strategic objectives once the offensive begins? Sarah looked at the display again, this time focusing on critical infrastructure, population centers, and supply bottlenecks. The answer was obvious and terrifying. For months, she said quietly. Captain Therill nodded grimly. The Alliance High Command has reached the same conclusion. We're facing a strategic scenario where conventional military doctrine will result in catastrophic defeat. Why are you showing me this? Because 3 weeks ago, you demonstrated tactical capabilities that no one in Alliance Command had previously conceived. Your approach to the Kepler 442 simulation revealed strategic thinking that could potentially change the entire paradigm of galactic warfare. Sarah felt the weight of impossible responsibility settling on her shoulders. Captain, I'm a first-year cadet. I can't possibly. You're the first human to receive advanced tactical training at the academy level, Captain Therill interrupted. But, more importantly, you may represent cognitive capabilities that humanity has been developing for 12,000 years, specifically for scenarios like this. The holographic display shifted to show detailed psychological profiles of Hegemony command staff. Sarah found herself automatically analyzing their decision-making patterns, cultural biases, and likely strategic preferences. They're making the same mistake everyone makes when fighting humans, she said suddenly. Which is, they're assuming their opponents think like they do. Look at this force deployment. It's tactically brilliant from a hegemony perspective, but it's optimized for fighting alliance species that make decisions based on mathematical optimization and resource conservation. Sarah manipulated the display to highlight patterns in the hegemony strategy. They're using overwhelming force concentrations because their psychology values strength and direct confrontation. They're targeting infrastructure because their economic models assume that resource denial will force capitulation. They're maintaining rigid command hierarchies because their social structure is built on authoritarian control. And humans would respond differently. Humans would ignore the infrastructure, bypass the force concentrations, and attack the command structure directly, Sarah replied without hesitation. We let them capture territory while we destroyed their ability to hold it. We'd use their strength against them by making their victories into liabilities. Captain Therill's sensor array was working overtime. Elaborate on that strategy. Sarah began sketching out tactical concepts that felt as natural as breathing. The hegemony strategy assumes that capturing territory equals victory. But territory is only valuable if you can extract resources from it and defend it against counterattack. If Alliance forces made the captured territory economically worthless while simultaneously targeting hegemony supply lines. She paused, realizing what she was describing. You're outlining a total war scenario, Captain Therill observed. I'm outlining a winning scenario, Sarah corrected. The hegemony can't maintain extended supply lines while fighting a population that refuses to stay conquered. Their entire strategy is based on quick victories and negotiated settlements. And if they don't negotiate, Sarah looked at the tactical scenarios flowing through her mind and felt something cold and predatory stirring in her thoughts. Then they learned why humans spent 12,000 years perfecting the art of making their enemies regret starting fights they couldn't finish. The library around them had become completely silent. Captain Therill's mathematical mind was processing the strategic implications of what Sarah had just outlined, and the calculations were revealing possibilities that no galactic military theorist had previously considered. Cadet Chun, he said finally, I believe Admiral Korthax was correct about human tactical capabilities representing a significant advancement in galactic military theory. Captain, I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer. Of course. Are you asking me to develop strategies for fighting the hegemony because you think I'm uniquely qualified or because you think I'm uniquely dangerous? Captain Therill was quiet for a long time before responding. Does it matter? The hegemony threat is real, and conventional alliance doctrine will not be sufficient to counter it. If human cognitive evolution has produced tactical capabilities that could save alliance civilization, then those capabilities must be employed regardless of their implications. Sarah stared at the holographic display showing a galaxy on the brink of war and realized that her carefully planned future studying xenobiology had just become impossible. The Academy had discovered what humans were capable of, and now there would be no going back. "When do we start?" she asked. "We already have," Captain Thero replied. "Admiral Korthax has authorized the formation of a special tactical development unit. You'll be working directly with Alliance High Command to develop new strategic doctrines for the coming war." As Sarah gathered her research materials and prepared to leave the library, she caught her reflection in one of the polished surfaces and didn't recognize what she saw. 3 weeks ago, she had been a xenobiology student who wanted to understand other species. Now, she was becoming something that other species might need to fear. But as she walked through the academy corridors, noting the way other cadets avoided eye contact and gave her wide berths, she realized that the transformation had been inevitable from the moment she first set foot on the academy grounds. Humans didn't just study warfare, they embodied it. And now the galaxy was about to discover exactly what that meant. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the Alliance High Command's war room, watching real-time feeds from 17 different star systems as the hegemony offensive began exactly as she had predicted. The massive holographic display showed Alliance defensive lines crumbling under overwhelming force concentrations, while hegemony breakthrough units pushed deep into Alliance territory. The assembled command staff, representatives from 12 different species who had spent their careers mastering the art of galactic warfare, watched in stunned silence as their carefully prepared defenses proved completely inadequate against the coordinated assault. "Sector 77 Alpha has fallen," reported Admiral Korthax, his voice carrying the weight of a man watching his life's work collapse in real time. "Hegemony forces are advancing on the Tau Ceti industrial complexes. Sector 12 Gamma is requesting immediate reinforcement," added General Thyrus, a crystalline whose harmonic voice carried undertones of desperation. "They're facing 10-to-1 odds and cannot hold their positions." Sarah observed the chaos around her with the same calm, analytical mindset that had served her during the corridor encounter that seemed like a lifetime ago. Her brain had adapted to the scale of the threat, suppressing emotional responses while her tactical processing capabilities expanded to encompass entire star systems. "Admiral," she said quietly, "it's time to implement the Terran doctrine." The war room fell silent, except for the constant chatter of emergency communications. Every being present had spent the past 6 months studying the strategic concepts Sarah had developed, but actually implementing them against a live enemy was something else entirely. "Cadet Chun," Admiral Korthax said, using her old rank despite the fact that she had been officially transferred to the Strategic Development Division with the equivalent authority of a field commander. "Are you certain this will work?" Sarah studied the tactical display, showing the complete collapse of Alliance defensive strategy, then looked around the room at the assembled military leaders who were waiting for her decision. "Admiral, conventional defense has already failed. The hegemony is 12 hours ahead of their optimal timeline and will achieve breakthrough to Alliance core systems within 72 hours if current trends continue." "That's not what I asked." Sarah met the Admiral's gaze with eyes that had grown considerably colder over the past 6 months of strategic planning. "Sir, the Terran doctrine isn't designed to work. It's designed to win." Admiral Korthax nodded slowly, then activated his command override codes. "All Alliance forces, this is High Command. Authorization Omega-7 is now in effect." Repeat, Authorization Omega-7 is in effect. Strategic Command is transferring to Tactical Development Unit 1. The holographic display changed configuration as tactical control shifted from the traditional Alliance command structure to the specialized unit Sarah had spent months training. Instead of the defensive positions and resource conservation strategies that had defined galactic warfare for millennia, the new deployment orders reflected concepts that no non-human species had ever seriously considered. All Alliance forces in sectors 7 through 12. Sarah's voice carried across communication channels to thousands of ships and millions of military personnel. Begin immediate implementation of Protocol Scorched Earth. Repeat, Protocol Scorched Earth is now active. On the holographic display, Green Alliance markers began moving in patterns that would have seemed like retreat to casual observation. But Sarah was implementing something far more sophisticated than withdrawal. She was executing the strategic concept that humans had perfected over 12,000 years of warfare against their own kind. If the hegemony wanted Alliance territory, they could have it, but they would find it worthless. Admiral, Sarah continued, please authorize the activation of civilian evacuation protocols for all systems in the projected hegemony advance path. Cadet, those protocols will result in the abandonment of 17 inhabited systems representing 43 billion Alliance citizens. Sir, those citizens will be evacuated to safety rather than becoming casualties of hegemony occupation. But, more importantly, their evacuation will deny the hegemony the economic resources they need to sustain their offensive. General Thyrus's harmonic voice carried confusion and concern. Strategic Development Unit 1, please clarify Protocol Scorched Earth. Our forces are abandoning defensible positions and infrastructure without engaging the enemy. Correct, General. The hegemony strategy is based on rapid conquest and resource extraction. We're removing the resources while making the conquest irrelevant. The holographic display showed Alliance forces implementing tactics that looked like mass retreat, but were actually something far more devastating. Industrial facilities were being systematically disabled before abandonment. Transportation networks were being severed at critical junctions. Communication relays were being destroyed or reprogrammed to carry disinformation. Most significantly, the civilian populations that represented the economic foundation of every conquered system were being evacuated to Alliance core territories, leaving the hegemony in control of empty infrastructure that would cost more to maintain than it could possibly produce. The hegemony advance has slowed in Sector 9, reported Captain Therrell, who had been monitoring enemy tactical patterns. They're encountering resistance from automated defense systems that appear to be malfunctioning. Sarah allowed herself a small smile. Those aren't malfunctions, Captain. Those are cognitive warfare programs designed to exploit hegemony psychological patterns. The automated defenses weren't actually trying to stop the hegemony advance. They were designed to behave in ways that would trigger specific tactical responses. When hegemony forces encountered resistance, their cultural programming demanded overwhelming retaliation. But the resistance was always just strong enough to require massive resource expenditure while being too weak to provide any real opposition. The result was that hegemony forces were spending enormous amounts of ammunition, fuel, and time destroying targets that had no strategic value while exhausting themselves in the process. Strategic Development Unit 1, Admiral Korthax said, Hegemony Command is requesting negotiation. They're offering to halt their advance in exchange for territorial concessions. Sarah studied the tactical display showing hegemony forces scattered across 17 star systems. Their supply lines stretched to the breaking point as they tried to maintain control of territories that were consuming resources faster than they could extract them. Decline the negotiation, Admiral. Cadet, this could be an opportunity to end the conflict without further casualties. Sir, the conflict ends when the hegemony no longer has the capability to threaten Alliance territories. Negotiation at this point would simply give them time to consolidate their gains and prepare for the next offensive. Sarah manipulated the holographic display to show hegemony tactical positions and supply status. They're not requesting negotiation because they want peace. They're requesting negotiation because they're beginning to realize that they've been trapped. The assembled command staff studied the strategic situation with growing understanding. The hegemony had achieved everything they had planned for: territorial conquest, breakthrough of Alliance defenses, and apparent military victory. But instead of ending the war, their success had made their position increasingly untenable. Phase 2 of the Terran Doctrine is now beginning, Sarah announced. Alliance forces implement protocol asymmetric response. Target priorities are hegemony supply lines, command infrastructure, and economic support systems. The holographic display showed Alliance forces emerging from concealed positions throughout hegemony territory. Instead of the massive fleet engagements that had defined previous galactic conflicts, small Alliance units began targeting the infrastructure that the hegemony needed to maintain their conquest. Transport ships carrying supplies to conquered territories found themselves under attack from Alliance forces that appeared, struck, and vanished before reinforcements could arrive. Communication networks that connected Hegemony Command to their scattered forces began experiencing systematic failures that couldn't be repaired faster than they could be destroyed. Most devastating of all, the civilian populations that the Hegemony had expected to exploit for economic gain were no longer present, having been evacuated to Alliance territories where they continued to contribute to the war effort while denying their productivity to the occupying forces. "This is unprecedented," General Thyrus observed. "You've turned their victory into a liability. That's the fundamental principle of human warfare, General. We don't fight to win territories or resources. We fight to make our enemies regret starting the fight in the first place." 3 weeks into the implementation of the Terran Doctrine, the strategic situation had completely reversed. Hegemony forces controlled more territory than they had ever possessed, but they were hemorrhaging resources at an unsustainable rate while facing constant attacks from an enemy they couldn't pin down or defeat. Hegemony Command is requesting emergency negotiations, Admiral Korthax reported. They're offering complete withdrawal from Alliance territories in exchange for cessation of hostile activities. Sarah studied the tactical display, showing Hegemony forces retreating from their conquered positions as fast as they had originally advanced. Their supply lines were in complete collapse, their command structure was fragmenting under constant pressure, and their economic foundation was crumbling as the cost of maintaining their conquests exceeded any possible benefit. Counteroffer, Admiral. Complete hegemony disarmament, reparations for Alliance civilian evacuation costs, and guaranteed non-aggression agreements for 100 standard years. Cadet. Those terms amount to unconditional surrender. The hegemony will never accept them. Sir, the hegemony no longer has any other choice. Their offensive capability has been neutralized, their economic foundation has been undermined, and their territorial conquests have become economic liabilities. They can accept our terms or face total collapse. The war room's communication systems lit up with incoming transmissions from hegemony leadership. Sarah listened to the frantic requests for negotiation, the desperate offers of compromise, and the growing recognition that they had been systematically outmaneuvered by an opponent they had never understood. "Admiral," she said finally, "the hegemony is requesting permission to surrender unconditionally." Admiral Korthax stared at the holographic display showing the complete reversal of what had appeared to be inevitable Alliance defeat just months earlier. "How long did you know this would happen?" "Since the moment I saw their original offensive strategy, sir. They were fighting the kind of war they understood against an opponent who had spent 12,000 years learning how to fight wars that couldn't be won through conventional means." Sarah looked around the war room at the assembled command staff who were trying to process the implications of what they had witnessed. The hegemony made the same mistake that everyone makes when they underestimate humans. They assumed we would fight the way we appear to fight, rather than the way we were designed to fight. And how are humans designed to fight? General Thyrus asked. Sarah's expression carried something that made every being in the room unconsciously step back slightly. "We're designed to be the thing that our enemies have nightmares about long after they've forgotten why they started fighting us in the first place." The holographic display showed the final hegemony forces abandoning their conquered territories, leaving behind empty infrastructure that would take decades to repair and civilian populations that would never trust them again. The most successful military offensive in galactic history had been transformed into a complete strategic disaster through the application of tactical principles that no other species had ever conceived. "Admiral," Sarah said, "I recommend we begin developing long-term strategic plans for Alliance expansion into former hegemony territories. Our evacuation protocols created refugee populations that will need new homes, and the hegemony surrender terms include resource reparations that could fund colonial development for centuries. Admiral Korthax realized that the human cadet who had been attacked in Academy corridors 6 months earlier had just orchestrated the complete restructuring of galactic political balance. Cadet Chun, what do you intend to do now? Sarah looked at the tactical display, showing a galaxy where human strategic concepts had proven capable of defeating any conceivable threat, then turned back to the assembled command staff with eyes that had grown very cold over the past months. Now, Admiral, I think it's time the galactic community learned what it really means to have humans as allies rather than enemies. The war room fell silent as the assembled military leaders processed the implications of that statement. They had welcomed humanity into the galactic community, believing that humans were simply another species seeking peaceful cooperation. They were beginning to realize that they had actually invited apex predators to join their civilization. Predators that had spent millennia perfecting the art of warfare against opponents just as intelligent and dangerous as themselves. And those predators had just demonstrated that they could outfight, outthink, and outmaneuver any threat the galaxy could produce. Sarah Chun, the human cadet who had once struggled to keep up with basic combat drills, was no longer the weakest link in her class. She had become something that other species would study, respect, and very carefully avoid provoking. The monster that had been sleeping in human genetic code for millions of years was finally awake, and it was smiling.